And this third and final video is about what happens during the very brief reign of William Henry Harrison and the following reign of John Tyler as President of the United States. So William Henry Harrison wins the election of 1840 against Martin Van Buren. Harrison is a Whig, Van Buren was a Democrat. In 1841, Hard-Ciderites, that's the name of the people who supported Harrison, they all flocked to Washington, D.C. for Harrison's inauguration and hoping to enjoy the spoils of office, maybe get a political position. Now, the two main Whigs at this time were Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and Clay and Webster had planned to sort of run the presidency through the old and feeble William Henry Harrison. But that plan was destroyed when Harrison died only 4 weeks after giving one of the longest inauguration addresses in American history. He died from pneumonia. And with Harrison's death, his vice president, John Tyler, became president. Now, Clay and Webster knew they would not be able to run the government through Tyler like they thought they might have been able to through Harrison. So, needless to say, Clay and Webster were not pleased with the death of Harrison. So who is John Tyler? John Tyler was very different from William Henry Harrison. He was 6 feet tall, he had blue eyes, he was described as a Virginia gentleman, he was gracious. He was seen as a Democrat at heart, though. Even though he was elected with William Henry Harrison, a Whig, Tyler was a former member of the Democratic Party. He only left the Democratic Party because he disliked Jackson's style of rule. And so as a former Democrat, barely a Whig, he clashed with a lot of the people in his own party. Tyler, unlike most Whigs, embraced states' rights. Most Whigs were typically pro-bank, pro-tariff, pro-internal improvements, but not Tyler. This led to two major battles between Tyler and Henry Clay in passing nationalist reform or nationalist legislation in the U.S. The first thing that they battled about was, well, the National Bank. Van Buren had passed that divorce bill separating the government from the economy. But now the Whigs were back in power and they wanted to get the government more involved with the economy. So Clay and Congress, they passed this plan for a new national bank, but Tyler, who was supposed to be on Clay's side, vetoes it, saying that it's unconstitutional, it's not practical. So Clay edits his plan for now a fiscal corporation, which is still another version of government involvement in the economy. Tyler vetoes this again. The Democrats are pleased. They're watching a Whig president and a Whig legislature, Congress, basically beat each other to a standstill, and the Democrats do not even have to try to block these nationalist reforms. So what happens lastly is that the Whigs, they actually formally vote Tyler out of the party. They attempt to impeach him, but they're unsuccessful. Tyler's entire cabinet ends up resigning, except for the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, who was doing some important negotiations with England at the time. We'll get into that in a moment. The second issue that Tyler and Clay battle over has to do with tariffs. Tyler vetoed Whig tariffs and a plan that would redistribute money from the sale of Western lands to states. Tyler felt that that money should stay in the diminished, meaning pretty small, federal treasury. He didn't want to be giving that money out when he thought the federal government needed to be shored up or stabilized. Congress and Clay, on the other hand, redrafted a bill to eliminate the distribution of states, hoping to still be able to pass the tariffs, but just taking out that redistribution bit that Tyler seemed to disagree with. Tyler did agree to sign this. This was called the Tariff of 1842. It brought tariff rates down to about 32%, and it recognized, or it showed that Tyler did recognize the need for federal revenue, for money to be collected by the federal government. While Tyler was president, the U.S. came pretty close to a third war with Great Britain, and there were a couple different reasons why this happened. The first was purely social, and that was aristocratic British travelers were attacking American lifestyle and American society, and this stirred up angry reactions from Americans. Even well-known British authors like Charles Dickens took out ads attacking the U.S. for things like the fact that the U.S. didn't have copyright laws, so Charles Dickens couldn't get profits from any of his books, that were published in the US because he was a foreign author. Another major foreign relations issue with Britain was called the Caroline Affair. And the Caroline was a boat. And the reason that this boat was important was because the British sank this American boat in 1837. They sank it because Americans had been providing support, financial and military support, to a group of Canadian rebels who were trying to break away from Britain. The rebellion was unsuccessful, but the British were still very upset that US citizens were supporting this rebellion. So in response, the British attacked and sank this boat, the Caroline, which made for very tense relations between the US and Great Britain. Another form of tension was economic. Americans were expanding and building canals and railroads at this time, which required borrowing money from Great Britain. Now, when the financial panic of 1837 hit, the relationship between British creditors, people giving out loans, and American borrowers, people taking loans, became extremely stressed. A fourth issue with Great Britain during the presidency of John Tyler had to do with another boat. This was called the Creole. The Creole was, in 1841, it was transporting 130 Virginia slaves. These slaves seized control of the ship in a slave rebellion, and they tried to take that boat, the slaves tried to take that boat to the British islands in the Caribbean. The British had already abolished the slave trade, and these African slaves were hoping that if they could make it to the British Caribbean islands, that they themselves would be accepted as free men. Now, the South feared that the British islands would protect the escaped slaves, and this upset the South because those slaves were an important part of their economy, and they were seen as property that were, rightfully paid for and owned by Southerners. Last issue with Canada or Great Britain during this time period had to do with some disputed land in Maine. The British were trying to build a road, and this road would go through area that was used by both Americans and Canadian lumberjacks. And both sides locally called up their militias and fought this conflict for this land that was called the Mini-Aroostook War. Now, the conflict was cleared up when the British sent an ambassador to discuss negotiations with Webster over the land, and the US and Great Britain agreed to compromise on this dispute, and the US got a slightly better half of the offer. They got 7,000 square miles out of the 12,000 square miles in dispute. The British got less land, but the British were happy because they got the territory that they needed to build this road between two British Canadian cities, Halifax and Quebec. And additionally, in this agreement between a British ambassador and US Secretary of State Daniel Webster, the US gained 6,500 square miles further west, out past the Great Lakes by Minnesota. And this turned out to be really important later on because this land we got from this disagreement in Maine turned out to have a very priceless form of iron ore that was very beneficial for the American economy.